Ladies and gentlemen, we've got a session now with 5 presentations, each of 15 minutes. I've asked the speakers to stick strictly to time so we can have some good opportunity for discussion and debate afterwards. And the first speaker is Jacqueline Lyttle, who is from the UK, from Devon in the south, and she is a healthcare consultant. She has an accounting background and has moved into the National Health Service. She's going to give us an example of some problems that patients have, and her talk is on facing the NHS, National Health Service challenge, understanding the costs and pathways of chronic pain patients.
Thank you. I'd like to reinforce some of the messages from Professor Krez from earlier, and also the last speaker, about the impact of when patients aren't managed and about the need to raise the profile of pain. Move that on. Is it moving on? Sorry. Pain represents an enormous burden to the NHS, both the healthcare system and wider economy. And as already been said before, back pain alone accounts for £12.3 billion a year. And actually more than 7.8 million people in the UK are affected by pain. And one of the things that we looked at last year was the whole system impact of patients not being treated. And actually it was about the delays in the system and the burden across the wider system in addition to patients, and looking at the impact on primary care and secondary care. And actually when we started looking at the work, it was quite startling. It was actually a much bigger burden than we anticipated. I work with commissioners, and actually they're now responsible for more than 65% of the budget of the NHS in England, and actually it was something that was not known to them, which was quite scary actually. One of the things that we anecdotally know in the NHS, that the burden of pain is enormous. But actually a lot of the information was not, it wasn't well recognised, it hadn't been identified, and we hadn't pulled the activity out. And what we tried to do was actually look at the impact of patients not being treated, not just on them, but on the system, and also what it meant to them getting back to work, and what Anna was saying before about when they were in work and the associated reductions in productivity. One of the things that we looked at in the NHS is actually there is anecdotal evidence that if pain isn't appropriately managed, and this is no different to any other European country, there's avoidable steps to primary care and GPs and physicians, there's avoidable steps and delays in the patient pathways, activity in secondary care is avoidable and also very, very costly. And what we found was that actually the only person that understood the journey from beginning to end was the patient. And speakers have already said earlier this afternoon that actually we don't always listen to the patient's voice. And actually as professionals we need to sort of put patients at the centre of what we do. And whilst within the UK we can calculate the burden and we can provide the evidence and also demonstrate the need for pain services and to improve and raise the profile of pain, there is no standard approach to commissioning pain services in the United Kingdom. And I think partly that's for a number of reasons. I think it's never been seen as a priority despite these facts. It's not seen as a separate service, and I think one of the speakers spoke earlier is about it seen as an add-on, as an extra. No one dies from it directly, and we haven't had a political champion. And more importantly for me, it's never been seen as a long-term condition, even though we now feel that it should be. We tried to compare pain with other long-term conditions. So we've got COPD, we've got asthma, we've got diabetes, and if you look at the stats, actually pain is a greater burden than asthma, COPD and diabetes combined, but this isn't well recognised in the UK, and actually those other long-term conditions have got much more high profile. We've got more investment in those areas, but actually I think we should be sort of switching the emphasis to pain. as opposed to long-term conditions. The NHS, along with many countries in the EU, is facing its greatest financial challenge. We've got to find efficiency savings of £20 billion by 2014 within the NHS, and we can't continue to do that by merely making the system go faster and looking at discrete pathways. We need to look at all of it. And what we tried to do was to get a real understanding of the economic pressures of not managing pain. So we wanted to look at reducing clinical variation, reducing or eliminating waste, and also really understanding the impact on unnecessary activity in primary and secondary care, and also to try and release some of the efficiency savings and sort of improving the patient journey. And I think the aim was really to understand the whole system impact and also making the system more productive overall, not just bits of it. We often make changes in the NHS where we make one change and it affects the whole system, but we don't always have a real good understanding of that, and I think other healthcare systems are probably the same. A small task group was set up where we actually mapped very in great detail real patients, and we wanted to identify the waste and delays when best practice was not followed. So some of the things that the speakers have been speaking about this afternoon, we don't feel that actually that is universally adopted in the UK. And we mapped the patients from at the start of their journey, from their initial presentation with the GP right the way through to when their pain was adequately controlled. We looked at the overall journey length, the delays, the unadded value steps in the system, and tried to cost it. And we hadn't done this before. We'd done some of the costing, some of the health economic data again hadn't been captured, so we tried to capture as much of it as possible. We also looked at the amount of time taken off from paid employment and also the impact of when patients were at work and their sort of less productivity levels as well. This diagram and the next one, it's quite difficult to see, but we've tried to pictorially illustrate the impact of patients going through the system. We identified that all of the patients that we saw had multiple loops once they got into secondary care. Depending on the route that they got into the healthcare system, if they were sent to the orthopaedic surgeon because it was a back pain, and then they couldn't find what the problem was, they were moved to gastro. We found that they moved from one specialism to another. They were handed over to multi-professionals, and actually the burden on the patient was enormous, but also the burden on the system was equally as troublesome as well. This following one is a real patient, and I'll go through it quickly because of time, but we mapped every single part of their journey, even down to the analgesia and how they were feeling at the time. And actually, this patient journey was one of the short ones. From beginning to end, it was 17 months, by which time the patient's pain had deteriorated, their condition became more chronic. They had side effects as a result of opioid analgesia and ended up in hospital with constipation. So all of those steps, if their pain had been appropriately managed, we feel we could have been avoided. And then we overlaid this with patient stories about actually how it affected their life, and that was very powerful as well. So these are real patients and real costs within the United Kingdom. And this hadn't been done before on the scale that we did. We've done bits of it, but we hadn't done all of it. One of the things that we demonstrated that this one, for example, the overall length for 17 months, it cost £5,000 for this from beginning to end. And actually the avoidable steps were 9, and actually the waste in the system was 3/4 of the cost, so it's an enormous cost of a system. This patient was a patient who didn't take that much time off work, but they took 42 days off. And the work, we found that actually the anecdotes were in fact real, and it wasn't just a gut feeling. We found that all the patients that we looked at were a real burden, and actually they were much larger than we anticipated. The WHO ladder of analgesia was not consistently used. There was an enormous range of sort of a small cohort of 6 patients we looked at, for example, avoidable delays to seeing GPs, multiple visits to hospital, and a high level of analgesia cost. So all of that combined, we found quite profound and quite remarkable. some of the patients, they had avoidable, and if their pain had been better managed, they didn't need to go to A&E, emergency admissions, an invasive diagnostic test as well. And one of the things that we did for the first time was to equate how much their healthcare burden cost compared to the mean allocation per head of population. And the mean allocation in the UK for last year was £1,935, and on average the cost of a chronic pain patient was about £6,000. So they were consuming about 3 times the amount of money that was actually put into the system. And again, there was a huge disparity and difference between the number of days that patients were taken off work. So what we've tried to do as a consequence of this work is raise the profile of pain within commissioners at a local level, and work is now underway with the Royal College of GPs, the Royal College of Anaesthesia and the British Pain Society to raise the profile of pain at a more strategic level, which I think is really, really important. And we're also developing guidance to bring best practice commissioning guidance to people across the United Kingdom. I think the real problem that we identified was that there's a huge burden if the pain care is uncoordinated, when patients get moved from one healthcare system and one professional to another. And I think it's the fact that pain is not seen as a high priority. And I think we should take the same approach that we've done with other long-term and chronic diseases. And I think the big challenge now is to get pain on the NHS priority as a service area in its own right. Thank you very much.